Well, let me also introduce myself. I'm Constance Backhouse. I'm a bencher, and I teach at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, where my specialty is legal history. And I chair the Heritage Committee for the benchers, which is devoted to compiling and preserving the history of the profession. And one of the projects that we've been involved with is to look at some of the early lawyers from the diverse communities in our profession, because a lot of that history is not known. And members of the public ask all the time, and we can't identify who the first and the early lawyers were from these different communities. And so we resolved to get started on a website that would compile as much information as we could put together. And Alison Kirk Montgomery has been our expert consultant, who has done an extraordinary job of contacting the various communities, trying to collect information, writing up the short biographies, finding photographs, doing basic contextual research. It's been just wonderful, and all credit goes to her for having organized the session today. And I'm just a hanger-on as the chair of the Heritage Committee, except that I have one claim to fame. I wasn't Hungarian, but my mother was Polish, and it's close. And I was an official state delegate with the former Governor General Mikhail Jean when she went to Central Europe, and we visited Hungary. That was the infamous visit where she was called back early because of the crisis in the House of Commons and the request by the Prime Minister for the dissolution. And so I was able to see Hungary at its finest, as if we were state visitors. We were treated like royalty, and it was just an extraordinary opportunity for me to be there. And so I feel some bond of connection with all of you, and I'm looking forward to our workshop today enormously.
Hungary and Poland had the same king for about 200 years, about 1100, 1200 or so.
There is a long history of Hungary, isn't there? And in Hungarians in Canada.
And more recently, I was at the Hungarian uprising started, but the very start of it was at a statue of a General Ben, who was a general who was in fact supporting the Hungarian uprising in 1848. And that's where the whole thing started. So there's lots of Polish, Hungarian.
We can thank the Poles for being here.
That is really interesting. And when I started, thank you, Constance, by the way, I have really enjoyed this project and enjoyed learning about Hungarians, to see how long a history Hungarians have in this country, and including some lawyers, some earlier lawyers too, from the late 19th century that started, and I want to ask you about that. And thank you for your kind words about the project, but I'd like to start with Paul Leatherdale, who's the archivist of the Law Society, who has been amazing finding out what we have about lawyers who have died, and some wonderful photographs and so forth. So in a moment I'm going to start with you, Paul, and we can maybe introduce ourselves, but I do want to just go over briefly a few things about what we hope to achieve, but who knows what will happen. But we do want to focus on how you are Hungarian, what does it mean to be Hungarian-Canadian, how that affected your decision to become a lawyer or to be involved with the legal profession, and then how being a Hungarian-Canadian affected your practice. So it's an awful lot to talk about, and I'm looking forward to hearing some stories about it. I also want to first of all thank Frank Felkai for his wonderful help in putting people together for this roundtable. I appreciate it very much, in the face of adversity too, Frank. I also want to pass on regrets from Chief Justice Boncalo, Ivan Whitehall, Robert Pressler, Alexandra Salkai, and Sophia Spardakos of our staff, who isn't well today. Okay, I think that's it. Now, can we go around and just introduce ourselves briefly, and then we'll start on how it is that you're Hungarian-Canadian, if you are. Paul?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Paul Leatherdale, and I'm the archivist for the Law Society of Upper Canada. And I'm just here this afternoon basically as a sponge, just to absorb your stories that you have. I'm responsible for preserving the Law Society's records, plus records of lawyers, legal organizations that get donated to the archives, as well as the records that come out of this Diversifying the Bar project. And I'm here to make a plea to you all that if you happen to have any records, like newsletters, photographs, anything about your legal careers that you would be interested in donating to the archives, we would certainly be interested in them.
Thank you, Paul. Frank?
Frank Paul May. I was born in Budapest, like a lot of other people around this table. I came in 1956. Exactly a month to the day that we left Budapest, we landed in St. John, New Brunswick, thanks to the generosity of the Canadian government, and started my career in engineering, and then through family court, ended up in law.
Thank you.
I'm Gabe Takash, born Labor Takash. I too came in 1956. Took a little longer than Frank. Had a 6-month stopover in Ireland. That's where I learned how to speak English. So I landed here, landed with an English accent. And I too became an engineer, and a couple of years after that decided to go to law, and have practiced law since 1971. And I'm still with the same firm that I started with in 1971.
Thank you.
My name is Katalin Kirek, born Katalin Vilagi, and my parents came in 1968 during the Czech Revolution. They spent some time in custody through various countries getting visas on their way here. So they arrived 5 days before I was born. I actually spoke Hungarian as my first language, went to Hungarian school here all the way through high school, danced with the Kodai ensemble. My husband is from there, so the whole family is Hungarian. The extended family is Hungarian. We're still very much attached to the community. I didn't intend to become a lawyer. Turns out my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, is one. But I was third on the waiting list at Kingston Medical School as a human biology, zoology double major, and they didn't take me, but law did, so what can I say? Here I am. Went into criminal law. I'm an assistant crown attorney here in downtown Toronto, and I never looked back.
My name's Judy Rakai, and I was born in Budapest. My parents left Budapest in 1950, and I was in tow. We took a bit longer to get here. Now, I guess we left in 48, and we went to Paris. It took 18 months to get here, and finally the Canadians let us come. The other alternative was a letter from Pakistan, from one of the universities, inviting my father to teach there, but luckily this letter came as well. And we arrived, we had to go, my father had to go to Kitchener to do his internship, and then we came back here. I was raised, I guess, in an ethnic family where you had to do something, and that's how I fell into law. After museology and psychology, and I started out doing criminal law just on a part-time basis, because when I was in the bar admission course here, Justice Gloria Epstein, as she is now, and I were two women, which was shocking enough, but we were both pregnant. She with her second child, me with my first. And that caused incredible confusion in the bar admissions committee. I mean, they didn't know what to do with that. She, I think she's continues to be very proficient at what she does. You know, popped her second one out and was fine. Mine was 3 weeks late, so that interfered with corporate and commercial as we had to do then. And then I fell into criminal law because my husband was a crown, and I followed someone around as a part-time crown attorney.
Opposing him?
Yeah. No, we were together, we were doing the same side. But I left earlier. When I finally got a full-time job, because they gave us part-time jobs, then part-time contract, then full-time contract, then finally a permanent job, I was pregnant with my fourth, had him, took 6 months maternity leave, and then came back for 6 months and then left to do defense work, and I've been doing that ever since.
Good, thank you. Frank?
My name is Frank Felkai. I was born in Budapest. My first exposure to law as a young child was 1949 to 52, when under communist Stalinist Hungary they had show trials, and reading about these traitors who confessed to being American and Tito's spies, and they hanged them 49 to 51. And then when Khrushchev denounced Stalin in February of 1956, revealed the Stalinist atrocities, all of a sudden they had new trials without any other scientific evidence, and they decided that these are false confessions, beaten out of them. This was the chief of police, the foreign minister, and hundreds of police officers and even secret police officers, and they reburied them in the summer of 1956. One of the contributing factors to the revolution, which broke out in October. So that was my exposure. All of a sudden, of course, these police officers said, well, this guy was sitting beside me, he confessed to be a spy, so we hanged him unjustly. So that was my first exposure. We escaped in 1956, November, and we flying to Canada, and as Frank mentioned, the generosity of Canada, in Vienna we had to sign an undertaking to repay the passage, the airfare passage to Canada when we arrived. And I never forget it. We're just near Iceland, getting near Greenland, and the announcement, they found a flight attendant who could speak some Hungarian and explained that the government of Canada just canceled the repayment. So champagne all around on the plane. We settled in Tilsonburg. I attended the same high school as Laura Lake, not the same time, Tilsonburg District High School at the same time. Came to U of T. Decision was to go on to be an academic or law. I chose law, U of T Law School, went through law school. And I got the tax prize in law school, but then I decided I didn't want it. I wanted to do litigation, so switched courses. I went to Ottawa for 2.5 years, maybe more about that later. And I've been practicing litigation, now counsel to Rochon Genova.
Pardon me, I'm George Switcher, and I was born in Nyíregyháza in 1950. And I just was dragged across the border with my family in 1956 because I was only 7. So my sister as well, it was a year the night we crossed the border. And she's here too. Then I followed wherever my parents took us, and which was first in New York. We lived in Poughkeepsie, and then we lived in Brooklyn. And then I followed them again in '73. When they came to Toronto. After that, I left them and went to Hamilton, where I practiced law for, until 1993. So I was at Osgood Hall until '76, called in '78, practiced primarily family law in Hamilton, was appointed to the bench in 1993 and was transferred here to Toronto in 2007. Frank was my bar ad seminar leader, and I think that's the first time that I met him. And I think after that, he taught me everything I need to know about Hungarian law, the law community. But between graduating university and law school, I was first a teacher. I did that for 1 year. I can't recall really what brought me to law, but I think my parents thought I should have a better profession than. Not that teaching isn't a great profession, since my wife was a teacher for 30 plus years, but they thought I should do more. And so I always listened to my parents.
Peter Rakai, and I'm Judith's cousin. As Judith told you, her dad and in the accompaniment of my father, they were brothers, came from Hungary in 1950 via Paris, where they had some form of refugee status. And, the gentleman always maintained that if you had to be a refugee, Paris was a good place to be a refugee. Having said that, life wasn't easy, and they came to Canada, where my dad eventually became a specialist in internal medicine, and Judith's father and my dad started a hospital called the Central Hospital, which was dedicated to treating new Canadians, most of whom couldn't speak English well and who needed special care when they found themselves in a hospital situation for the first time. There was extraordinarily heavy pressure on me, and I think on Judy, to become a medical doctor, since our fathers were both doctors. Grandfather was a doctor. However, I left them with no illusions from early on in life, and that was not going to happen. But I did, and choosing law, I did retain a great interest in the immigrant experience, and became an immigration lawyer and a specialist in citizenship and immigration law. The offspring of the Central Hospitals are at the moment a pair of nursing homes, which are public nonprofit nursing homes, one of which recently rebuilt at the site of the old Wellesley Hospital. And have for the past few years been the chair of the board of this organization. But I was born here. I was the first of the family to be born on this side.
Okay.
And Constance, I too have a Polish mother, so we share that.
I'm Peter Sullivan. I wasn't born in Hungary, but my middle daughter was. She was born in our apartment in the Rozsa Dome during a 3-year assignment we had in Budapest. I was with the diplomatic service for 35 years. Prior to that, my first exposure to Hungary was via Frank, who we were colleagues in undergraduate school at UT and then at law school as well. He went directly to, well, not directly to law, but he went to Ottawa for a while. I decided to take a few years off and travel, but I ended up having too much fun to stay with the diplomatic service for 35 years. But now I'm with a law firm, American Burles, and I work primarily in 2 countries. Unfortunately, Hungary's not there, but I'd like it to be there. My principal focus is on India and Saudi Arabia.
Wonderful. So there's a lot of people left in trauma, and here we are today. Almost everybody, isn't it? Very few planned, careful thinking out of, the future by families. Just happened.
My parents ran for it, absolutely ran for it. They hid out in the bushes on the Hungarian border to the south because the Czech Revolution was going on. You weren't going to get a visa, and it took too long. And they found themselves young and unmarried and with a child on the way in Hungary. And what they knew for sure was that they weren't going to do that the way things were there. And so they had to actually camp out in the bushes for a couple of weeks waiting for a bridge to be cemented over. And they've left their footprints in that bridge somewhere. They ran with medical books, actually. The stories are quite repeated of the harrowing experience, because what they took with them wasn't what you'd think. They took medical books and Pepto-Bismol medical books in case they got shot at, so that the suitcases were full of something that would protect them. And it was only what they could carry. My family's from the south, so from Page. And then my mother's from a one-room shack in a village with no running water and no electricity called Suka, not too far from there. And they ran with grandma, my mom's mom. So they were in their, my parents in their 20s and grandma in her 40s at the time. And they actually hid in the bushes waiting for them to cement this bridge so they could get across the border, after which they were immediately arrested in a number of countries. Pepto-Bismol actually got them, interestingly, to a lot of good cultural experiences, oddly, because my mother was pregnant. So under arrest, they didn't want to put her in jail in Austria. And my grandmother was an older lady, so they didn't want to put her in her 40s, where I am now. They didn't want to put her in jail. So they kept my dad in jail. And the other thing they brought along was a lot of Pepto-Bismol, with the epidemic of drinking that goes on in Eastern Europe, or certainly did at the time. He made them feel better. They let him out for the night. He came back in the morning. They would go to the opera in the evenings and go back to jail during the day. And eventually we also found ourselves in Paris, and there was this snowstorm, and the planes were grounded for 24 hours. My mother's standing there tapping her foot. Kids due in 5 days. Let us across. And then they went to St. Catherine's, because I'm the only daughter. My mother is an only daughter, but my grandmother had 3 brothers, one of which came to Canada in '56. And Uncle Stephen was an agricultural engineer in St. Catherine's. And so that's where they went for the first week or 2 when they got here, which is fortunate, because my mother was expecting a boy in Hungary, ended up with a girl in Canada, and always insists that they spelled my name Catherine, and I had it translated back to the Hungarian when I was 18, and they spelt it like the city. which is differently spelled than the name. I was born Catharine. And I kept telling her, you know, what if I would have been born in Moose Jaw? Well, but they figured it was a good girl's name and they were going to keep it. And so that's where we started and immediately came to Toronto and got going. And the only plan was, we've come out here, we've worked this hard all my life. The phrase was, you're going to be something. It didn't matter what, but darn it, you were going to be something. We came here to make the best for you, and you are going to be something.
Does that strike a note with anyone else?
Well, I don't know if, I think it was always expected, you know, that they'd change their lives. Peter's parents and my parents came out. They did have visas, but I think it was a bit nefarious the way they got visas and sort of through, I think my father operated on a wife of someone who could provide visas. And we came out, my parents had 2 small children. I was 13 months old and my sister was 5. It was organized. They didn't know where they were going though. Although my uncle, Peter's father and my father had traveled some, I don't think my mother had really traveled. And she must have been in her early 20s. And they were young to come out with 2 small children to go, they didn't know where. And they were shown pictures. I only ate eggs and milk at that time, apparently. And they were shown pictures of people lining up in France in front of a store. And the caption was, "There's no food." So my father had an egg crate constructed for the trip. And of course led to all sorts of problems in terms of, you know, the eggs breaking and customs officials going through the whole egg crate. And when they got to Paris, they came out and they saw people lining up. Well, they were lining up because baguettes, or, you know, French bread was baked every 3 hours, and the Frenchmen would never eat an old piece of bread. And that's what they were lining up for, the fresh breads. And just beside the bakery was a store that just had eggs all the way up the front window. But it was hard in France. We all lived in, well, 4 of us lived in one room at a hotel, which still exists, the hotel. And they waited every day for news as to where they could go. For 18 months, they weren't allowed to work.
Do these stories, which are more dramatic and I think probably more famous than most immigration stories, I mean the freedom fighters and so forth, do these make a bond among lawyers of Hungarian background or no? I mean,
Frankly, there were only 2 other lawyers in Hamilton that I knew of that the only thing that brought us together was if we spoke Hungarian. And those of us who spoke Hungarian, we would know each other only because people would seek us out who were Hungarians who wanted a lawyer who spoke Hungarian. And as I recall, there was only 2 other people in the city of Hamilton. So that was about the closest thing to a bond that we had. Now, mind you, I left my parents who were here in Toronto, and the Toronto community, I think, was closer. Although there is a Hamilton Hungarian community, I didn't grow up there. And my wife isn't Hungarian, and my children do not speak Hungarian. I didn't go to Hungarian school. I already spoke Hungarian, but I spoke at a level of well, let me say this. The revolution broke out in October, and I finished my Hungarian education in October, and I was in 1st grade. And my Hungarian was as good as a 1st grader.
Family Hungarian.
That's right. And I learned more Hungarian when I practiced law because clients would teach me, because I didn't know how to say things like will in Hungarian. I didn't know how to sue. I remember the first people who came to me and they would say to me, "Well, you're pretty smart, you speak a little bit of Hungarian, but let me teach you some legal words." And they would teach me good enough so that I would be able to sue somebody, or that I would be able to help them. And the other place that I would learn about, these are some, I try to recall some of that. I would get called from places where they said they needed a Hungarian-speaking lawyer. And for example, I almost didn't want to say this, but the Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital, for example, that I would get called because there were people there on lieutenant government warrants, for example, and they say they needed a Hungarian person to speak to someone, and I would go there and I would speak to someone, and I would, after a while, I started representing a group of people there too, where I would get phone calls from a variety of places, whether it was a nursing home or other places like that. So that's sort of, that became my connection to the Hungarian community. And then a few other lawyers who would then call me and say, my Hungarian is worse than your Hungarian, or something like that. And that's really the connection I think we had. Although my parents had a connection to the Hungarian community, the local Toronto community, I had a very different connection to the community.
Hungarians seem to assimilate really well, too.
I was going to, Alison, I wanted to take you back just before we start moving into assimilation, something that Catalin was remarking on, and that is that, so we were all of the age of, you were, I guess,
Just
seven,
about
seven or
yeah.
eight, I was
Yeah.
13. You were a little bit older, I think, but not
14.
that much. 14. Coming through these adventures of escaping, and so my story is the same. A moonless night, going over plowed fields, hoping to find the border and not cross back in again with flares and all that kind of stuff. But you're a 13-year-old kid and you had no responsibilities. I think that the real heroes were our parents, who when you put yourself into their position, I think my mother and father were probably around 39, 40, maybe not even that old, to pick up with absolutely no knowledge of, leaving everything behind and no prospect of, what's coming. And so I think they are the people that these are all amazing stories individually. They're kind of fun stories for us, but we had absolutely no responsibilities. We were there for the ride. And so you mentioned that aspect of it. I think
It's really important because I remember we had just bought the firewood for the house, and the decision to leave, and my parents closed the door, and that was a big expense to buy the firewood for the house. And we had to then take a train from Nyíregyháza to Budapest. And then in Budapest we met up with other people, and then they had to plan their escape. And I remember the bus ride to the border, and exactly as you said, the flares. And then my sister, who was a year old, she had to be drugged so she wouldn't wake up as we crossed over the border. And I remember her waking up and people screaming that they should kill her or shut her up because they were afraid that they were going to get caught. And you would hear, because by that time the borders were being patrolled, and you would hear voices of people getting captured, and you would hear crying, and you would hear soldiers capturing other people. So we would have to, so my father was already at that point 48, and my mother was 16 years young, because I'm also a child of survivors, so my parents were survivors as well. So I think every day at 48 they had no money. They came with watches, was what they bought. They bought watches to bribe people along the border, and they came with one suitcase, and they didn't speak the language at all. So the sacrifices they made were for the two of us. And there were other people in the group, but I mean my sister and myself. So I think that's absolutely correct that they are by far.
May I add that we also escaped, but on half an hour's notice. We didn't plan, went to the railway station, and you either got on that train, going to Vienna, or you didn't. And my mother insists that we go because I did participate too much in the revolution. And like others, we got near the border, walked all night, about 20-25 kilometers across plowed fields with Russian patrols, Soviet patrols, shooting in the background. And if you had bad luck, you ran into them. The Hungarian border patrol deserted. They weren't around yet. But the Soviet patrols were crossing. If they caught you, they brought you back to jail. So we walked all night. And the only luck we had was that when we crossed into Austria, there was a canal. So you know that across the canal, some people swam it, that you were in Austria. And the Austrian peasants brought out bonfires. You could walk to them in the distance, and took us to towns. But there was dramatic escapes. And others were caught. If you had bad luck, you ran into Soviet patrols and you're taken back.
From the Canadian side, how times have changed. My parents found out that my mother's brother and sister and child were on a plane from Vienna to Canada. And then they found out that instead of landing in Toronto, they were going to divert the plane to Winnipeg. So my father phoned information, and the immigration, I think he was the Minister of Immigration in Ottawa, it was Pickersgill. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, he phoned Mr. Pickersgill at home and said that this was a travesty, but because most people wanted to come to Toronto, and they diverted the plane back.
Amazing.
And I was, because when you said 7 years of age, you know, I was seven, and we went to the airport, and I remember still going in my pajamas to pick these strangers up who had come from 56.
And I know Frank had something to say too.
Well, I just want to pick up on something that Gabor said, but just to complete the circle, because in addition to the amount of gratefulness to our parents for what they did, I want to just emphasize the Canadian government, because Pickersgill actually went over, the Minister of Immigration went over to Austria to pave the way for Hungarians to come to Canada. We were processed in less than a week in Vienna. I recently looked, because my mother keeps everything, the visa application waived security clearances and waived health clearances. A lot of Hungarians had tuberculosis. They were brought and put into sanatoriums. I found out recently that the Canadian government chartered a boat. It was the Empress of Britain, a fairly large liner at the time, to bring us across. We left Liverpool on, it was December the 7th or December the 8th, 1956. The whole boat was full of Hungarian refugees. It was not on the schedule. And there were only 2 countries that accepted Hungarian refugees without quota. One was Canada, the other one was Venezuela. Thank God my parents chose Canada. So the Canadian government was unbelievably generous towards the Hungarians.
I came on a plane chartered by the government of Canada, Canadian Pacific Airlines number 361, I remember. And they chartered several airplanes. And as you said, Mr. Pickersgill came. By the way, Mr. Pickersgill told me this story. He was that Minister of Immigration, that he went to Vienna, and a lady of a certain age came up to him, said, "I'm from Toronto. I'm with the IODE," I think she said. I believe she was the mother of John Jennings, now the Honorable John Jennings, and said, "There is outside a camp in Austria where there's a whole university of forestry, students and faculty, and they want to stay together."
And they took them to BC.
And she told Pickersgill about this, and Pickersgill gave instructions to facilitate this. And he said he called Ottawa back and called the senior minister, Mrs. Sinclair, Margaret Trudeau's father, who was senior minister from British Columbia. "Can you find me a camp where they could put them in a forestry type of camp?" And called his friend Walter Harris, then Minister of Finance, "I need $1 million. Can you do this?" And next day, yes and yes. So the whole faculty from Chopron was flown by the government of Canada to a lumber camp that were just being closed down by one of the big lumber forestry in British Columbia. And they all graduated as students and faculty.
Overwhelming. I mean, the experience and the reception that
Mhm.
Canadians gave everybody. I mean, how did your parents deal with that? Did that feeling of gratitude and continue on, or what?
My father always said he didn't mind paying taxes because of what Canada had offered him. You know, and they gave back, I thought, what my parents did. My uncle and the hospital, and they loved living here, and they felt they were Canadian.
Well, 4 members of your family are in orders in Canada, is that correct?
Yeah.
For their work at the hospital and broadcasting to your mother?
My mother with the writing, and her in her will, she wanted her ashes left in Lake Ontario or the St. Lawrence, because that was her passage here.
And did you do that?
Not yet.
Oh.
She just passed, so.
So at that time, to become Canadian citizens, you have to wait 5 years. And there was a book called The Canadian Scene, which people were provided to prepare for the examination that you had to do before a judge. And I remember my father was helping him read through because his English was not good. They insisted that we talk Hungarian at home so we wouldn't lose the language, which meant that they were a little bit slower in picking up the language. And so my father comes in, he says, I'm going to be the first Canadian, as he was reading through this book, and I said, well, how do you figure that? And there was a demographic breakdown of Canada, which English, French, Italians, which totaled the population. He said, look at that, not one Canadian, I will be the first one. And that was just indicative of the tremendous respect and love that they had for the country.
Well, this is a good time, Frank, for you to tell that story, though. I would like to hear about the other side a little bit. There was a certain suspicion about some communist, say, tendencies in some Hungarians, possibly.
I slipped the story, which is coming back to haunt me. I was doing the bar admission course in 1969, 1970, and I was offered a job by Herb Gray. Then he was a new minister, junior minister of finance under Ben Benson. And he was, let me just say that he offered me a job, and I met with him, and I said, by the way, I've got something in my closet you should know before you make the offer definite, that as a young boy in Hungary, under the communist system, I was in the Young Communist League. They called us pioneers. You guys remember that we had red kerchiefs. You were enrolled automatically. There's only 2 Jehovah's Witnesses I knew who refused to enroll. Everybody else got enrolled automatically. So technically, I was a member of the Young Communist Movement. So they gave me this long form to fill out about security. And I filled it out and I put it in, Young Communist. And then before my job is confirmed, I had to go to Ottawa, the Privy Council office in Parliament Hill. And because he was a minister with our portfolio, Herb Gray was the Privy Council office that looked after security. Now, in Hungarian, it sounds worse, came elhárító, or really counter-espionage. And I remember the guy's name, Lieutenant Colonel Lemieux, RCMP. So I meet with him, he looked at the books, went over, asked me a few questions, and he said, well, Mr. Falkai, so I got to tell you this. I've never seen anybody applying for high clearance in the government of Canada. This is 1970. And access to cabinet, not the highest, highest level of security for government documents, who admits of having been a communist. And he said, but we believe in you, and Herb wants you, and we accept you. But there was that question, and a good thing I put it down. I put it down. May I just say that my second encounter with Canadian law was 1985, Bar Convention in Ottawa. And the Minister of Justice at the time, the Titian, is having his usual reception for the bar. And there's a reception line, there's in the Titian. Next to him is Frank Iacobucci, Deputy Minister of Justice, my former professor and soccer coach at law school. And we shake hands. And then the next person is a guy called Ivan Whitehall. Some of you have it. And he looks at me, had a nice mustache, and Ivan Whitehall says to me in perfect Hungarian, he says, Frank, you and I come from the same place. I just about fell over. He was by then one of the senior litigators in justice. And turns out that he was also escaped 56, 57. And so that was just a great shock to meet him in that context. If I just may want a quick anecdote, then 5-6 years ago, we were representing 2 warring Hungarian families, a big will dispute, but one of them gets nothing from their grandparents. So their daughter remembers all of a sudden that about 25 years ago, my uncle molested me when I was a child sexually. So we had a trial 25 years later for sexual assault. We come to 361 University, And we're walking along in the building, and they're talking, and I said, please don't talk. I was co-counsel, don't talk, the walls have ears. So we get in the elevator, and they start talking Hungarian. And then I said, told you don't to talk. So we walk down the hallway, get down, and the Crown comes over to us, to Defense Counsel. He says, Frank and so, he says, please tell your Hungarians, don't talk. I understand Hungarian. That was Kim Motil from Scarborough.
Really?
So it was all of a sudden, don't talk. I understand.
Well, my husband always says that everyone's Hungarian. He's not, or married to one.
Yes. Yes.
They're around.
Yes. Well, everybody at work tells me they either have a Hungarian grandparent. I have a number of young counsel from the defense bar as well, who are partially Hungarian. We apparently also seem to mix particularly well, not just with the Polish, but with the Irish and Scottish.
Mm-hmm. That's my husband.
That is a heavily combined. There is something about, not all of Great Britain, the Irish and the Scottish and the Hungarians, holy cow, do we ever get along.
My wife's a Dunbar.
There you go. And my stepfather's an Allen.
The airlift was all about the same time. I know that's when a lot of Scots and Brits came over, maybe.
Yeah.
That's it. But that is interesting. Does the ability to speak Hungarian, has it shaped other people's practices here then?
Strangely, yes.
You didn't
Because I'm
expect it.
Not at all. I'm a Crown attorney.
Yes.
And we work with, when I don't have clients. And so I work in law in a completely different way. The reality is there aren't a lot of Hungarians. And so first they either notice the name and present themselves if they're brave enough, but the ones that don't, there's only one Hungarian interpreter for the whole city, and when he's not available and somebody needs to be released and it's Friday, there's no conflict of interest, so I will then be the interpreter. So I had to learn the word tolmács because I had to suddenly, and bíró interpreter.
Oh,
Bíró is judge, but above and beyond that, I knew nothing. Even though I was born, my first 3 years I spoke nothing but Hungarian. But you don't speak legal Hungarian. So unfortunately, no one in my family had been arrested. So we had, not here anyway. So we didn't have any connection to that kind of language. And I had to learn it to assist in court. And I still do it on a regular basis. I'm either called when they don't have somebody, or more commonly, it's someone's first appearance. And I recognize the name and they come up and look confused, and we make it quite clear that they don't understand, but I can help them.
But it's not a hugely represented group
No.
in the criminal justice system.
No.
You know,
Not
I
hugely.
have clients, I have people who want to be my client, and I say, I only do criminal law. And in Hungarian, kriminális means, it's criminal, but it's not criminal. It's just bad, when what he did to me was criminal.
That's right.
And then I send them on to Frank.
Peter, did you have to learn?
I did speak that very childlike Hungarian, which and found it very difficult to speak about legal issues. So I would normally, to this day, if I have a Hungarian come in, I would normally ask them to bring someone to help me out. And we'll usually start with the interpreter, and then I will hear them speak until talk to the interpreter, and then I can maybe move in for a little bit, and then when it gets a little bit complicated as well, I move out a bit. But the bond is there once they realize that I am understanding them and able to converse. There is something that we of Hungarian background understand about our clients, which is that all Hungarians are self-appointed experts in every profession, regardless of whether they are part of that profession or not. So a Hungarian client will typically second guess their lawyer, their doctor, their engineer, their everybody. And Judy's father used to have a famous line, and he was, I think, once lectured by a patient of his who was a barber about the fact that he had misdiagnosed him. He had a better idea with respect to his surgery. Judy's father would say, look, he says, let's make a deal. You don't talk to me about surgery, I won't cut your hair. And that was that's sort of a standard answer, because Hungarians are aggressively interested in their futures. I think it's important to say. And but I've also seen in my career very, and I guess a number of us have seen a new generation of Hungarians coming from Hungary, young Hungarians who don't share our backgrounds. They come from a very different world. I think we saw those who originally came from a sort of a Soviet school upbringing. That wasn't one generation, and now we're seeing already a post sort of Soviet era, and they are different, as they are bound to be, and they have a different outlook. There's still certain Hungarianisms about them which will not go away, but as the generations change, as their experiences in Hungary have been different, they bring different things to the table, very, very different.
That's interesting. Keep going.
Well, I think it's the Second World War, the post-war, that experience isn't there. For those who haven't grown up in the Soviet system, who've already sort of grown up in that post-world, they are more Western than Central European. I'm seeing some nods, and their expectations are different, and they're carrying less of that past that we all carry here today. It's very different. Well, the one thing I can say, and just following up on what Frank and I think and others were saying earlier, our parents were certainly very, very grateful to the Canadian government, because they were very well treated in terms of bringing them over and establishment. But one, I think, unique factor of the Canadian government's attitude at the time, which unfortunately didn't go on in subsequent decades, was that they were able to put the Hungarians back to work in the fields in which many of them were trained. So with some retraining, a doctor would become a doctor again, an engineer would become an engineer again, a teacher would become a teacher again. And that was very, very important to them. I mean, if we had taken away those who had already established their livelihoods, and we had taken those livelihoods away from them, I think they would have had very different lives, and we as their children would have had very different lives. You couldn't do it in all cases, obviously. You couldn't give back every immigrant his professional or her professional life. But in many cases you could, and they're the ones who in many cases went on to make great contributions in their fields. And that stopped happening 20 years ago when our professional associations and organizations began making it very, very difficult for new immigrants to return to their fields. And those are much sadder people for that having happened. So I think
much less productive.
Yeah, much less productive and much less happy.
I mean, when I think of, when you ask, how do you consider yourself, right? When I think of my father and my uncle, they considered themselves doctors first, and then everything else came second to that, so you're Hungarian-Canadian father or whatever, I don't know what order, but they were doctors first.
But for obvious reasons, that was not the case in the law. And in fact, if you went and did a bit of a research to see what were the number of instances of your father's experience in medicine translated into going through bar admission course again or doing whatever it is that you had to do, and there are very, very few examples. There was a fellow Tories who was there when I started the article, a guy named Cornel Eberts, who had one of these stories where he told me that he used to push bodies in the tunnel between the two hospitals in University Avenue as a night job while he was going to Law Hall I think he had to re-qualify completely. I think he had to go to law school, and then at that time it was just a single law school at Osgood Hall. And he's the only example that I can remember of an older generation. He was a 49er or 48er. And my I had an uncle who was a lawyer who tried, and he just couldn't get over the language, and he ended up being a title searcher, and you know that was his. He wanted to stay in the law, but he just couldn't make it through law. But I don't, Frank, you might know other examples.
Gabe
There
is,
aren't really very many.
Gabe is raising a good point that sort of medicine and especially engineering, engineers were quite easily transferable with their skills, and they succeeded the earliest and the best. The doctors or the human body is the same everywhere, but once they got training, they succeeded too. But law is so different, the whole concept, of course,
With
plus
the
the
civil
language
law.
difficulty. I only knew 2 people of that generation who, they had to go through law school. It took them a long time to qualify and did become lawyers, but only 2. Of
Who
them.
were they, Frank?
Where did Bosch train?
No, Bosch was born in Canada, or maybe he came as a baby. He was, Frank Bosch was the Hungarian lawyer prominent in Toronto for the longest time. He qualified in 1930s. He's the 2 names escape me, I'll remember them, but they're the only 2 I know who
And
qualified. So
Evers
the
would have been
law
the
was
third
very
one, yeah.
difficult.
In 68, by 68, my parents had to reschool as well. And my dad was a doctor, and they were both practicing. They were completed, when they came. And my dad was a doctor, he just had to re-intern and re-exam after he learned English. My mother, however, they would not accept any of her nursing training, not any. And they had met in a hospital. My mother had been working in a hospital, and so she had to learn English and then go to night school and go right through training again as a nurse. But they weren't giving up who they were. I guess also that there comes the work ethic where you're going to be something. We not only got you here, but we put ourselves back through it again because they wouldn't accept it. And you would think the human body wouldn't be any different, but they certainly wouldn't accept my mom's training. And while she was trying to get through, my parents actually divorced when I was 3. She was on her own, still learning the language, had to reschool herself. And this isn't a gratefulness to the to the Canadian government, but to the Canadian people. She attended at a nursing home and said, you know, I've got a 3-year-old at home and my mom, who I'm trying to look after, I'm trying to put myself back through nursing school, and that's why I'm applying for the job. You know, I'll work hard. And the woman in 1970 took $100 out of her own pocket and handed it over and said, get a uniform and I'll see you tomorrow night.
That's a lot of money because in
That was
70,
a lot of money. Go get
in
yourself a
79 when I
uniform,
was
feed your
articling,
kid. Oh yeah,
it was $102 a week.
yeah. It was quite something. And then when somewhere we lived sometimes on the part of a house, and so at one point we must have been the 2nd floor. And there was a lady with 21 children who had lived on the 1st. And apparently, despite the 21 children, she taught my mother everything about how to, you know, diaper one-handed and the whole business. She was awesome. But that's sort of what we learned. And we actually, speaking of Hungarians not getting rid of anything, and they don't throw things away, we got a kit when we came, and there's a plastic mixing bowl and a spoon and 1 pot for cooking, sort of a basic functioning care kit, and we still have a fair number of those pieces.
Speaking of care kit, what about if we have a coffee and?
May I just say for a second
Yes.
that our friend Peter Sutherland, I
Yes.
know, has to leave early.
Yes.
Now, a
Thank you.
Canadian, a former diplomat, former ambassador of Canada to Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia, and Budapest. Peter, from Budapest, 1979-80, roughly, that's when you were there. How did you see us?
Well, first of all, I want to say the stories that have been told around the state are really fascinating. So I applaud the Law Society for bringing this group together. And I hope you do something with the stories that are here because they really are fascinating. Probably more fascinating than some other immigrant groups who didn't come in the same circumstances. I mean, the hardships and the courage that your parents showed to just uproot themselves with young families and to come to, in many cases, they didn't know they were going to end up in Canada. They just were getting out of Hungary. I mean, that's really outstanding. And us, it was very gratifying for all of us that are Canadians to understand or to hear that the Canadian government was so welcoming and helpful at the time that you left Hungary. So I think, first of all, that's certainly worth recording and putting on the record. From a Canadian point of view, I remember when I was in Hungary, I had some very good friends. Even I knew Frank before I left, and I met some people here who used to run a company called Electroverk, the photos, based in Montreal. And they were, as I found out, typical of Hungarians, extremely friendly and hospitable, and wanted to make sure that when we, me and my family, two daughters at the time, were going to be feeling right at home in Budapest. So, very interesting family. When Minori Kovács was the patriarch of the family, they lived on a hill in Budapest. Minori Kovács had been a very prominent engineer, but was clearly a person who was not sympathetic to the communist regime. So he lost his job and was supported by his sons, who at the time were, I guess, probably in their late 30s, early 40s, running companies and being more hewing to the line of the regime in power. But Minori Kovács and his whole 3 generations of family just sort of embraced us and made sure that our stay in Hungary was excellent. I mean, we were just like part of their family. In fact, I mentioned my second daughter was born there. It turned out that one of their daughters was pregnant at the same time, so they were born 2 days apart and played together and things like that. And my first daughter, when we arrived in Hungary, was 6 weeks old. So her first 3 years were in Hungary. So she grew up speaking Hungarian as well as English because she was a shishi mama, a nanny. And so she, first of all, she got very large because they fed her a lot of sweets. Hungarians love sweets, and they didn't know it. So our daughter got quite big, but very proficient in Hungarian. Unfortunately, a lot of that's gone now, but whenever she goes into a Hungarian restaurant and she hears a few familiar words, she starts remembering Hungarian lullabies and things like that. So all that to say that our experience in Hungary was really probably was the most, from a family point of view, the highlight of our 35 years abroad. Wonderful people. And when I came back to Canada, I was so impressed by the number of Hungarians that surfaced I was able to identify as Hungarians and were so successful. And I remember Frank and another Hungarian also told me, he said, you know, one thing about Hungarians, either they're going to be very successful or they're going to be in jail. Nobody's really over. That's not a problem too, I think. It's a wonderful country and wonderful people.
Were you there, what years were you there?
77 to 80.
77, 80.
So
that was...
Yeah,
that
very
was,
interesting, because in those days, the
Afghan war was still on?
Yes.
So that was still in that.
It was interesting because the Russian tourists would come to Budapest for R&R, quite frankly, and they'd look around and see all these wonderful peaches and fresh fruits and produce in the marketplace and the entertainment, the joie de vivre that was prevalent in Budapest. And they say, something's wrong here. You know, we're supposed to be the colonial power. These are supposed to be people that are under our diktat. And in fact, they've got a much better life than we have. But the Hungarians were able, they're very shrewd in their relationship with the Soviets. They were allowed to have a lot of sort of discretion in terms of their domestic policy, so long as in their foreign policy they followed the party line. And they played that very, very well.
Very interesting. On the note of peaches and plums again, I think we will with our coffee.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank
We have to
you.
leave. We only have half an hour left, so we want to be sure to cover a few things. And we focused on 1956, before and after. I'd like to go a little bit back in time and forward in time too, and maybe we'll go forward first. In 1989, of course, everything changed in Hungary. And Gabe, I'd like you to talk about the internship program with Hungarian and Eastern European lawyers that you were involved with, and Frank and some other people too.
Well, that was a very, just by way of background, in 89, things had changed, and lawyers who were trained under the pre-Berlin Wall regime were continued to be lawyers, but they needed to somehow regroup and figure out how they were going to deal with things. And I think it was an initiative that was sponsored by Maureen McTeer, and my political history isn't good enough. Peter, maybe you'd be more aware as to exactly what government was in at that time, but I know that Maureen was the champion of the government paying for lawyers from behind the Iron Curtain, recently liberated countries or ones that were behind the Iron Curtain to acclimatize them in our law. And so a large number of Hungarian lawyers arrived here, and I think the Bar Association and the law societies were involved in allocating them to law firms. I took one in each of the rotations, and the idea was that they were supposed to follow you around just to see how things went. Well, in fact, I'm not sure exactly how successful it was. In all cases, there were language issues, and there was also client issues as to who's this extra person watching what we're doing here. But I think generally it was a fairly successful program from their perspective, and it went on for 3 or 4 years, because there were 3 or 4 month stints, as I recall, that we had a fair number of them rotating through, and we made some very good friendships at the time. One of them was at McCarthy's, and he ended up being the senior partner for Baker McKenzie in the Toronto office, or in the Budapest office, and probably is as successful a lawyer as any of us sitting around this table.
You know who else was involved in that kind of stuff? I thought it was Bela Feher, wasn't he?
Feher was
involved.
He was one of the sponsors, yes.
Yes. And may I say, thanks to the government of Canada, Peter, you know this, at that time in 89, 91, the government of Canada waived work permits, visa permits for these lawyers who came just for retraining and didn't have to meet visa requirements.
That's interesting. Was anyone else involved in that program here?
I did. I was involved with some, but they tended to go to larger firms.
Larger firms could afford them,
Yes.
and so they were at firms like
The rich lawyers like Gabe's.
Well, they also got, you were more easily just make them be lost in the process, because nobody knew who is this guy sitting there. They thought it was a student, so I didn't have to. I could work under the radar, and I think that probably McCarthy's and other places it was the same system.
Okay.
Yeah, we had them both in our Ottawa office and our Toronto office. And then the other thing the Canadian Bar Association did, one of the lawyers, in-house counsel at the Canadian Bar Association at that time was of Hungarian background, and he and Maureen McTeer organized a lecture group to go to Hungary in 1990 to speak. The bar in Hungary is licensed on a city basis, so the equivalent law society of Canada would be Law Society of Budapest, and Gabor and I and a group of others, roughly half spoke Hungarian, half were, like Maureen McTeer, did not speak Hungarian, gave a series of lectures to the Hungarian lawyers on substantive law. I did law from administration, and it was a real eye-opener, because their system was so different, and they were trying to climb out of a system that was it was so difficult, and it was so strongly controlled that at one point they had to pass a rule, because you could not become a lawyer unless one of the bar admitted you, and it was a closed system, and that the top 10 students from the law school had to be given a job so that they could become lawyers, because the top students sometimes didn't make it. And so it was a heady period, both for the Hungarians and for us.
Frank, the person you mentioned, he was the executive director of the Canadian Bar Association, George Boros. George Boros, I think he's still in Gatineau, Quebec. You know?
Yes. No, I remember.
George Boros, B-O-R-O-S.
He was probably the
key
organizer of
and Boros means wine, so Boros means with wine.
And why he became executive director of the Canadian Bar Association, when they landed in Canada as refugees, they landed in Lévis, Quebec, across from Quebec City. So his English and French were perfect, plus Hungarian, so that's how he got the national job.
Interesting. There's another period that I think is very interesting in Hungarian-Canadian history, for Ontario anyway, and that's the whole Tillsonburg Tobacco District history. And I wonder if anybody has some information about that. I know, Frank, you were born in Tillsonburg, did you say?
No, we was born in Budapest,
Oh, sorry,
but
of course,
we
yeah.
settled in the Tilsonburg
Yes.
Tobacco District. Yes, there was a lawyer, Bernie Toth. He just died about a
Yes.
month ago, unfortunately. He was, and there were a lot of rich farmers, the tobacco farmers, a lot of rich families then. And Michael de Groot, Hamilton Ticats fame, he came from there. Bob Pressler, whom I invited but
Yes.
declined. Bob Pressler was from Langton, Tilsonburg. He was just, his pictures in the Law Society magazine, having been a lawyer for 50 years. He speaks excellent Hungarian, but he does mainly real estate in the States. And well, Salkai went down to Windsor. He couldn't come.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
there
What
was,
about the Wappel brothers? The Wappel brothers.
That's,
they were not really. They were more Toronto than.
But they were born. They were born to parents of sort of 35-ish.
Yes. Oh yeah.
So they were here before the war.
Tom was invited. He
Yeah.
declined.
And they both. It's interesting because they ended up having a Hungarian practice on.
Yeah,
on
yeah. And Tom Wappel became the first. Well, Bob Andrews allegedly was the first Hungarian member of parliament, but Tom Wappel was the first one of our generation who became member of parliament.
He was the only Hungarian lawyer I knew when I found myself in law. And I've never met him, just as far as names go.
So,
It was the only name that I knew at the time.
Well, you may recall in the 90s we used to have a Hungarian, sort of a lunch for Hungarian lawyers. I can't remember.
Chamber
what
of
it
Commerce was more.
Chamber of Commerce house, and there would be the folks who worked downtown, and typically would get 5 or 6, and a number of bottles of wine, and no work in the afternoon after that.
May I say that one of my famous Hungarian experiences with the law, I'm stretching it, was the Advocate Society had a convention in Hong Kong and Shanghai in 1988. And coming back, we went with my wife and I went with 4 pieces of luggage, and from coming back we had 9 pieces of luggage. But we stopped over in San Francisco just to sightsee, and hadn't been there before, and just to get the time change over. And I had worked National Revenue Customs and Excise. As soon as we get to near the customs officer, I realized, looking at myself, 9 pieces of luggage loaded. So we go to the U.S. Customs officer, big, burly, I think former Marine, and we explained our convention, we got this, we have to declare. Well, we declare in Canada. So you can't, you didn't put it into bond. At that time you could fly your luggage separately. Now you can't, but at that time you could put it into bond. Now you have to pay here. So, but I said, if we pay here now, we have to do it in Canada again. You have to do it twice. He said, sorry, this is what you did. You can't put it in bond now. You're here. I know you're going to a hotel. So we had a nice argument about that. He said, sorry, you got to pay. And then he says, go ahead that way, Mr. Falkai. I said, Mr. Falkai, stop. He says, looks at my passport. He says, Mr. Falkai, when did you come to Canada? He could see the place of birth. He says, 1956. 1956? Yes. You know what? Go ahead. My wife also came in 56 from Hungary. So he just let us go.
See, everyone's Hungarian.
Yeah. Or the spouse.
I have another an anecdote that has to do actually with this building. In around 95, 96, the Minister of Justice for Hungary came to visit. I think it was an official visit, and he was hosted for a lunch by the Chief Justice, who at that time was Charlie Dublin, and both Charles Dublin and Frank Callahan, the 2 Chief Justices at the time, were Tory alumni. So I got a phone call to come in and sit. So I sat at Callahan's table with the deputy, and the Minister of Justice was sitting at Mr. Justice Dublin's table, and we I was just, it was total serendipity that I was able to go there, but these guys obviously must have thought that I was a wheel. So, so the next time we were in Hungary, which was, we were taking sort of annual trips then on some pretext or other for the first 4 or 5 years after 90, after that we sort of ran out of steam. But so on one of these trips, I got an invitation to visit the Minister of Justice, who we met here, and there was a room about this. Well, actually, the room was about 5 times the size. The Justice Ministry kept this building all through those years, and probably the furniture was all before the war as well. And it was really, really neat because this guy spent, the original appointment was for a half an hour to come and chat, and he kept blowing away the time. Like, you get a reminder from the secretary saying, you have your next meeting, and say, that's okay, let's keep going. And we went on for about an hour and a half, and this is going to be a bit of a boastful story. At one point he asked me, we were speaking in Hungarian entirely, and at one point he asked me, when are you coming home again? Which to me meant that, my Hungarian must have been at least sort of acceptable. But the story about these guys being here is really the reason I want to tell you this story is that in
That
fact,
must have been very moving too.
oh yeah, it was awesome.
You
Yeah.
tell the story. The Chief Justice of Hungary was here.
Yeah. And
Judith reminds me that a few years ago, Justice McMurtry was the Chief Justice of Ontario, and we had the Chief Justice of Hungary visiting, and I got a call from Chief Justice McMurtry, can I find some Hungarian-speaking judges? And I looked around, thought of him, so I find George, and then George says Lofchik is one too in Hamilton. Then you were,
Was that on the island? Was that
yeah, but I went to the
Yeah.
with RCYC,
Yeah.
and then because I could only come up really with 2, then they asked for Hungarian-speaking lawyers.
There are others,
Moncada.
judges
Yeah.
outside of Ontario too. But who did you?
Amy.
Well,
Oh,
Amy
of course,
Moncada.
Amy.
Moncada.
Of course,
Yeah.
Amy and I know each other. Well.
Yeah,
But I don't know if she speaks Hungarian, but does she
Yeah,
speak
she
Hungarian?
does.
She
Her
does.
mother- her mother's-
She actually was chief admin judge at College Park when I first
okay.
started,
Yeah.
and she actually went to my high school.
So Judith, you came and
yeah, it was very interesting, and it was a really good connection to.
We were waiting for an invitation back though.
No, we didn't get one. I didn't
That's
get
right.
one.
I know neither did I. Frank got all the invitations.
So,
Oh, so you went to that dinner?
I did.
That was
I
very
did.
nice.
And it was very interesting, and
You didn't call me.
No.
so there was very small.
Well, they needed chicks.
So do you think of yourselves as Hungarian-Canadian beyond when Frank calls you up to say, hey, there's a Hungarian around that,
Yeah, we're always Hungarian.
Yeah?
You know? Yeah.
Yeah, I was raised at home by grandma, who didn't learn English, worked at a Hungarian restaurant until 2 a.m. until she retired at 65 to help my mom make ends meet as a single parent. So Hungarian was always spoken in the house, and because in part because my dad insisted on Hungarian school, and then it became, for high school, it's free credit. So I got an extra high school credit for hanging out with my friends for 3 hours on Monday nights. Now, yes, I had to write exams and essays and all that stuff, but essentially, it was all right. And then my passion was the dance group, and I danced for 10 years, danced and taught with the Kodai Ensemble in Toronto. And I was in the years when Caravan was still running, so we still had a forum for it. We used to actually dance with other groups that came from Delhi, where there's a lot of them, and Ohio. And Cleveland had a big Hungarian group, at least at that time. But things have petered a bit, although our dance group still exists. There just isn't the forum for them that they're used to.
Is that your brother who runs it now? Or
My brother-in-law.
brother-in-law?
Yeah, my husband is the youngest of the Kiretzes, John. His older brother, Carl. John can't dance worth beans. He was there to pick up chicks, and he says that quite publicly, and unfortunately for him, it actually worked. So it supports his theory. His older brother, Carl, was in it for about 5 minutes. Their then older brother, Les, and his wife Erica. And it's very uncanny that a number of them married Hungarians from our teenagehood, from the dance group, and we all still hang out together. I still have friends from that era, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, now the president of the Kodály Ensemble is my brother-in-law Les and his wife Erica. They go back to Hungary every year. She still has relatives there.
What about the next generation?
My son married, his wife's mother is Hungarian and grandparents are Hungarian. I mean, I don't know what happens. And then my sister's daughter, so my niece, also married a young man whose mother and grandparents are Hungarian. So I'm not sure I don't know how that happens, but it does happen.
But it is I think that the marriage probably is what determines, to what
That's
extent
right.
you're going to stay connected. I married a girl from what I call Oakville, which has sort of all sorts of connotations.
You became rich.
No, I started to eat well done roast beef.
Not patching.
And so my kids don't speak Hungarian at all, and have never had any interest in
No,
it.
my children don't speak Hungarian.
And
No, mine don't.
during my days when I was president of the Hungarian Freedom Fighters and sort of doing stuff like that, I was called the born again Hungarian, and that sort of, it was a phase of my life when I was active with the Canadian, the Hungarian House and stuff like that, and then there are reasons why you do that and you move on to other things. And I think that there are a whole bunch of lawyers in town here that Frank and I just don't know about. I mean, my cousin, for example, who was born to my uncle and his wife on their way out from Hungary. He was actually born in London. So he's exactly 13 years old, because that's how old I was when we arrived. So he's 13 years younger than I am. He's practicing in McCarthy's. I would think that he probably has absolutely no connection with anything Hungarian.
Well, one of the differences may be that we were raised with grandparents as well who were
Right.
here. Our grandparent came out in 52, 53,
That's
I
right,
think.
yeah. 53.
And we all lived in a sixplex. So my grandmother and grandfather lived downstairs. Peter and his parents lived on one side of the building, and my parents lived on the other. So
And there was an unspecified tenant who nevertheless was Hungarian, who lived
Yes, he was Hungarian.
in the last apartment. It was reserved for
Hungarian doctor.
any Hungarian.
That is Dr. Sathmati,
That
whose
was-
son actually is in Hamilton and is an
Oh,
expert
no.
on autism.
And speaking of intermarriages, I understand, Constance, that your father married a Polish refugee
Yes.
from the Hitler invasion of Poland.
Yes.
This young lady escaped from having to go to Germany or to Soviet Union, whatever, escaped to Hungary, welcomed a lot of Polish, and
Well, yeah.
and your father married a Polish.
My father, she made it to a refugee camp in Hungary, somewhere in the middle of the war, when Hungary was relatively untouched, in her view, by the war, and she had already been through a great deal. And then when the Russians and Germans fought door to door at the end of the Second World War, the war came back to her. And since my father was involved politically in politics and was actually a member of parliament for a while in the Hungarian parliament, it was my mother who said, gigs up. He said, "You don't think the Russians are going to let you keep this democracy you're having?" And he said, "Well, I think they will. I think they need to." He says, "Look, I'm Polish. We have a long history with the Russians. It's not going to happen. And you've got to leave now before things get worse." And so they all left before the wall. But when things were already tight and they weren't allowed to leave, but the actual Iron Curtain had not descended.
November of 48.
Right, but my father and Judy's father both had friends who were politically involved who did end up in jail. Regardless of whether they were socialists or centrists or whatever, there was no room for them in the oncoming regime. And then my father, and I don't, it's interested to know who went back and when, but my father was very careful not to go back to
Ever?
Hungary. For a number, he went back and took me in the 70s, in the early 72, I think. And he only did so after he returned his Hungarian passport to the Hungarian embassy. And he was treated very nicely, and they understood why he was doing it, because there was a great fear that you take your teenage boy back to an Iron Curtain country, that you could still be asked to stay, or the child would be asked to serve in the military.
My sister and I were actually the guinea pigs, because when we were at university, my now brother-in-law organized a trip to Russia. And my father thought that if we were allowed to go to Russia and come back, that then maybe we should go to Hungary and test it out. So we went to Russia, we came back. The next time we went to Hungary and stayed for a couple of days. And nothing happened to us. So then my father went back. And the good part about not renouncing your citizenship is that my kids are Hungarian. They've applied for citizenship and received it, because in Hungary, contrary to some other countries, you have to specifically renounce your Hungarian citizenship because you're Hungarian unless you do that, which allows my children to be such. And
Like Conrad Black.
Well, yes, they
No, but in
didn't
fact, a
offer
number
us a
of
lordship, though. I didn't understand that.
And a number of Hungarians have done that, and I've been thinking about
Yeah.
doing it for my kids because it allows you
Yeah,
EU
sure.
well,
passports.
I have my second actually went to a term in Hungarian medical school and is now in Ireland. But my eldest was, well, they know how to control it too, because they don't want you to apply so that you can get free education in the EU. So you have to actually work in the EU or live in the EU for 3 years, and then it's okay. So my eldest actually was working in England for 3 years and then said, oh, I want to go to Cambridge and get a master's, and got his citizenship 3 days before his fees were due. And so he was able to take advantage of the EU
Are any,
price.
who has lawyers as children?
I have one lawyer.
One.
I have a son who's a lawyer.
Yeah.
It's ironic, the citizenship piece, and I think I mentioned this in the break, but it's a good segue into this.
Yes.
It's one of the reasons why my wife was resisting my applying for citizenship for my children, was that she was worried about the military service and whatnot. And
Yeah.
so I'm proud to tell you that, in fact, my son just came back last Saturday from a 7-month tour in Afghanistan.
Oh, really? Oh, congratulations.
Yeah. Well, it's nice now.
Where was he
Yeah.
in?
And in
Kandahar. Yeah.
And there's no longer mandatory, I didn't want them to get their
Right.
citizenship, but there's no longer mandatory
Mhm.
military
No.
service in Hungary,
But
so.
in the 60s and 70s, the Canadian government did caution
Yes.
Eastern Europeans not to go, or that there were consequences potentially of going back, and they couldn't help.
I went on my honeymoon for the first time back in '73. My wife was really afraid, because as we were crossing those times, you had to get a visa, and we went across by train, and then we
Yes.
had, remember how they used to come on the
There were tourists,
and I was sleeping, and they wanted to speak to me, and they only wanted to speak to me in Hungarian, so she was absolutely convinced something was going to happen. Of course, nothing happened, and we spent 3 days in Budapest, and then we went back for her 50th birthday, and she was born in Brooklyn. So she says to me, we went back for my 50th birthday to Hungary.
You're a good salesman.
But that was the first time that I went back to Nyíregyháza, because I hadn't gone back the first time. But because my parents were Holocaust survivors, there were no graves. So it's a really, really very difficult trip to make. There are monuments.
Monuments?
There are monuments, but we also went to a small town called Oros, which is near Nyíregyháza, where we actually found my grandfather's grave, and that survived the war notwithstanding. And I wasn't sure that it was his grave or not, because it was really like traveling back in time, even and this was in 1992. No, 2002, forgive me, 2002. And there was a thatched roof house across a mud road, which had a Jewish cemetery in a fence, chain link fence. And this woman in a kerchief came out, and she had the key to open up the cemetery. And she said that had her husband been alive, he would have been able to help me because he would know who was buried there. But she couldn't help, so we had to search around. And I tried to find the tombstone, and I found something which was a combination of Hungarian and Hebrew, and which I can't read Hungarian because, you know, I can speak it, but the reading of it is difficult. And in the Hebrew, I can make out the letters. But what happened is we subsequently discovered another relative who went back, who did a rubbing, and she confirmed for me that it was indeed my grandfather's grave, which was really a remarkable story.
We only have a few minutes left. And Judith, I want you to tell that story you told me earlier.
This is a story which I've remembered, and I think that it really shows the changes that have occurred in terms of Hungarians in Canada and just the world. I get a call from a detention facility. A young man wants to talk to me, and he wants me to represent him. And he gets on the phone. It's a Hungarian name, and we speak Hungarian. And he has to go to the Scarborough court. He's in custody, some sort of domestic assault thing. And next day I go to court, and I know everyone there, and I asked the guard to bring him from custody. And I'm sitting there waiting, and I'm impatient, but you know, I'm sitting there waiting. And they bring this young black man in, and I get upset because, you know, I'm there and I'm waiting, and why didn't they bring my client in? So I go and I talk to the guard, and I say, you know, what's going on? Why didn't you bring my client? He said, that is your client. And I said, no, my client is, you know, this name. And he said, yeah, that's your client. So I go over, and sure enough, and I'm quite taken aback, only in that he speaks way better Hungarian than I do, right? His name's Hungarian. Well, you know, Hungary under the communist regime sent engineers and forestry people and doctors and lawyers to Africa, and they, you know, got together and married African women, and he was raised in Hungary, and they emigrated here, and that was the new sort of face of Hungary and face of the world, where, you know, everybody is related in some way.
It is interesting. Would anybody like to add anything else before we say goodnight?
Thank you, Frank.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank
for-
you all. This has been fascinating for me. I hope you've enjoyed it too, and we will be in touch with transcripts and DVDs so you can watch yourself. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We supply